pleasure to introduce our presenter today, PJ Liesch. PJ is an extension entomology specialist and director of the University of Wisconsin Insect Diagnostic Lab, where he provides arthropod identification services for extension colleagues, the general public, agriculture producers, private industry, governmental agencies, and more. So PJ, we are so excited to have you here today to talk with us about emerald ash borer.
Thank you for the introduction, Peggy. Let me go ahead and get my slides pulled up. And thanks for joining me today to talk about emerald ash borer. As Anne had posted in the chat box feature, handouts for today's slides and presentation are available. I've got that web address on the screen right now. Otherwise, check the chat box. If you head to the website, on my menu, I've got a menu item for resources and then presentation notes. That should get you there, and it's labeled by the date. So hopefully you can find it pretty easily. But emerald ash borer is a topic that, depending on where you're located in the US or in Wisconsin, it maybe needs a little introduction. But as we'll see from some maps, there's some parts of Wisconsin where folks are really starting to see and experience this insect for the first time and really seeing how destructive it can be. So this is something that personally I have been working with one way or another for 18 years at this point. I gave my very first extension talk related to EAB back in about 2006 or so, and I started working a year before that on an EAB survey project. Looked at thousands of ash trees looking for EAB before we had confirmed it here in the state. So this is something I'm very well aware of. I've been watching this insect and working with it for almost 20 years at this point. So we're going to talk about a lot of things today, but let's jump in with some basics about emerald ash borer. We're going to talk about what are ash trees. Sometimes folks get tripped up a little bit there. We're going to talk about the appearance of these insects and what they look like in various life stages, their life cycle, talk about the impacts, the damage, the symptoms and signs to look for, and then we'll discuss management as well. And there's a lot of different management approaches. We'll spend a lot of time on the chemical insecticides because that's the kind of the commonest thing that we are doing at the moment. But some basics about emerald ash borer. So emerald ash borer, it's a non-native insect, comes from parts of East Asia, so it is invasive. It belongs to the family Buprestidae, which we commonly call either the jewel beetles or the metallic wood-boring beetles. And this is a very diverse family of insects. They're found worldwide. They have important cultural significance in some parts of the planet. This photo on the bottom right-hand portion of the slide just gives you kind of a quick survey of what some members of this group look like. This is not scaled appropriately for size, so some of these can be relatively small. There's one member of this family down in the Caribbean, for example, that can be about 2 or so inches long. There's some other ones in parts of the US that are itty bitty, maybe a quarter inch or less in size. Now, being a member of this family does not mean that you are a bad bug by any means. Most insects in this group, if they are borers, they tend to be relatively well behaved. And what I mean by that is they tend to leave healthy trees alone. And if they have evolved with a tree species or group of plants, they tend to attack the ones that are stressed and compromised. So if you've ever watched a nature documentary, you know that the wolves out in Yellowstone, they're not taking down the strong, robust male elk. They're going after, the ones that are old or sickly or weakened for this reason or that. So think of these insects in many cases in the same way. They aren't taking out the healthy trees or healthy stock. They're going after ones that are weakened. EAB is different though, because it will go after perfectly healthy, robust trees in addition to stressed ones. And that's going to come up again and again in today's talk. Now, I do want to say with the diversity of this family, there are a lot of close relatives here. EAB belongs to the genus Agrylus. Worldwide, that genus has about 3,000 species. Here in Wisconsin, we have about 50 species in that genus alone. So we have a lot of native lookalikes, including some that we might consider pests on occasion, like bronze birch borer associated with stressed birch trees, two-line chestnut borer, which don't really have chestnut trees around, but that one goes after stressed oak trees. So I'll show you some photos later on. They look very similar to EAB, but they have very different biologies and they don't pack as much of a punch in terms of their pest status. Now, when it comes to the life cycle of emerald ash borer, in the life stage, we're really concerned about it's the larvae. That's the juvenile stage. These feed beneath the bark and they cause damage to the tree's vascular tissues. These are tissues that transport water and nutrients. And so when those are damaged, it's basically girdling the tree from the inside. Now, one individual larva doesn't cause that much damage. You have to think of it as kind of death by hundreds or thousands of paper cuts. It's the cumulative damage of many, many larvae over the course of many years. And it depends on how high the EAB population is. If you have a really high population and a susceptible tree, it could potentially kill a tree in about 2-ish years. In a lot of situations, it might take 5 years or so for that tree actually to die. So it's a relatively slow process. It's not an overnight death of the tree. When you look at the US as a whole, though, we have billions of ash trees that are at risk. A number I have seen for Wisconsin is we have somewhere in the ballpark of about 750 million ash trees, about 750 million ash trees or somewhere thereabouts is our estimate. So there's a lot of ash trees at stake in Wisconsin, but when you look nationally, there's billions that are at risk from this insect. Now, why is EAB so good at being bad, or why is it so good at being invasive? Anytime you take an insect or an organism out of its native range, there is the possibility that it can be kind of a kid unsupervised in a candy shop. You take out some of those natural checks and balances. That's exactly what happened from the standpoint of EAB. Also, the native range of EAB, very similar latitude and climate and some of the same kind of host plants. There are ash trees in East Asia. So it was moved to a part of the country that has very similar climate. And so that gave it a leg up perhaps. But here's a couple of key reasons why EAB is so good at being bad, so to speak. It can attack both healthy and stress trees. I mentioned that close relatives tend to just attack and take out and kind of cull the herd of those weakened members. EAB can go to perfectly healthy ash trees and take them out. So it can be a very aggressive pest. Also can be very difficult to detect. And this theme is going to come up again and again today because the symptoms are very vague. They start in the far upper canopy of the tree and progress downwards. By the time you realize emerald ash borer might be present in, say, the main trunk of your tree, it's probably been there for 2, 3, 4 years. And where has it gone since then? And that was a problem when EAB was first introduced to the US. It took quite a few years to recognize what was going on. And by then it had spread elsewhere. So it's a very challenging pest to actually locate and detect at low populations levels. And it's also spread very easily by humans. If you left emerald ash borer alone, the adults would come out of a tree that they're associated with, that they emerged from, and they're probably going to stay within a distance of roughly a football field or thereabouts. They really don't pop out and fly 20 miles down the road. There's been studies where folks have stuck them in wind tunnels and forced them to fly. That's not very realistic. They tend to stick pretty close to home, so to speak. It's really the human factor here that has played a big role. The human movement of emerald ash borer from places like China or East Asia to the US initially, that was us. Humans did that. Movement from the initial epicenter of the infestation to elsewhere through firewood or wood packing materials. That's things like pallets and crates. Through movement of lumber, through movement of nursery stock, humans have played a really important role nationally with the movement of this insect. So because it can essentially be a good hitchhiker, that has really helped it out. Let's look at a brief history of emerald ash borer. And I want to say, if you are interested in the topic, I can't recommend this book enough. This is The Green Menace by Jordan Marche. He's actually a staff member here on campus at UW. He lives in the Madison area. And it's just an excellent read on kind of the history and developments of EAB, and explains in depth why it took us a while to figure out what was going on when EAB first showed up. So the brief history of this, I mentioned this already, but it's native to parts of East Asia, China, Mongolia, parts of Russia, and so on. We think it got in through solid wood packing materials. That's pallets and crates and similar things of that nature. It was first detected in the general Detroit area in 2002. So that's the epicenter. If you have a picture of the US map, the bullseye is basically the general Detroit area, and it's radiated outwards from there. I mentioned a moment ago the difficulty detecting this. So we think from some estimates that emerald ash borer probably actually got in sometime in the 1990s, and it just took a number of years to really figure out what it was and what was going on. And by then it had spread elsewhere. So shortly thereafter, it was discovered in nearby states of Ohio and Indiana. Makes sense given the proximity. We detected it for the first time in Wisconsin back in 2008 in Newburgh, which is pretty close to Port Washington, Ozaukee County area, so just north of Milwaukee a little bit. That is kind of our epicenter here in Wisconsin. A short while later, it was found along the Mississippi, Vernon, Crawford County, that part of the state. So southwestern Wisconsin, so that's kind of a secondary epicenter radiating outwards. And that'll come up again in some of the maps that I will show you. At the moment, it's currently known from 36 U.S. states and 5 Canadian provinces. So this thing has really been moved around U.S. and really North America. So this is from the emeraldashborer.info, the EAB Information Network website, which is a good resource, a lot of good information about emerald ash borer in general on that site. But again, imagine painting the bullseye in this map in about Detroit area, southeastern Michigan, and you can tell it's kind of radiated outwards from there. Due to natural movements, it wouldn't be very much, but humans have moved it around with firewood and lumber and nursery stock and things like that. Now, this doesn't tell you the full story, because this kind of gives the impression that EAB is absolutely everywhere. That's green. That's not quite the case. Let's look at another map here. This map shows a couple things. So first off, the red dots are county level detections of emerald ash borer. And this is a map from USDA, by the way. The greenish and yellowish colors, that is where ash trees occur in the US. So green is kind of, light green is the anticipated range. Dark green is where like ash trees have been surveyed. And then yellow areas are where there's been ash trees planted in urban environments. And that brings up an important topic. So we've all probably heard of Dutch elm disease. When Dutch elm went through and took out a lot of elms, which some parts of the country were very prevalent in urban areas, urban foresters looked for kind of the next hardy tree that would do well in urban environments, and ash trees fit the bill for a number of reasons. They could do well in urban areas. They could deal with some soil compaction. Places like Wisconsin with snow, they were relatively tolerant of salt and stuff like that. And so folks planted a lot of ash trees. In some regards, they really overplanted ash trees. We know if you put all your eggs in one basket, that can be a bad thing. So once EAB came on the scene, there were some cities and municipalities that had a relatively high percentage of ash trees in their urban forest, and that caused problems. Now, ash trees can be common in naturally forested areas too. If you look at Wisconsin alone, we see a lot of dark green in the northern part of the state. It turns out, numerically speaking, we have most of our ash trees in northern Wisconsin because the species like black ash can be very common in swampy areas. Now, notice as we go westward, ash trees basically hit parts of the Great Plains and they peter out. You can notice on the map some kind of finger-like projections of dark green. That's because species like green ash can do well along rivers in places like Nebraska. But basically, we get into the Great Plains, we start losing a lot of our trees, and there's agricultural areas and things like that too. So not many trees in the Great Plains. In theory, that should have acted as a natural barrier. But we notice some red spots in the map. The Front Range of Colorado, so kind of that area from Fort Collins, Boulder, Denver, that part of the state. We also see a jump in the map in northwestern Oregon State. People move these. They go on camping or move, this or that infested materials, and all of a sudden these things have jumped across some natural barriers. They can't fly that far to get there. But we know in the western U.S., we see some green out there. There's naturally occurring different ash species out there that are now at risk. So for a long time, it was thought, at least if EAB stays in the eastern U.S., the ash trees on the West Coast are fine, but now it has bridged that gap. And so that's going to be an evolving situation that's relatively recent out there. But this is the current status of where ash trees and EAB are in Wisconsin, or it's current within the last year or so. Let's look a little bit closer here in the state of Wisconsin. So at the moment, we have confirmed detections from 69 of our 72 counties. The 3 holdout counties are all in northwestern Wisconsin. That's Taylor, Burnett, and Washburn. Now, this map might give you the impression that emerald ash borer is everywhere in the state, and it really isn't. Remember, I mentioned a couple spots, Ozaukee County, just north of Milwaukee, Newburgh there, along the Mississippi, Vernon, Crawford counties, and so on. Those are kind of the 2 spots where it really started radiating outward from in the state. So let's look at a slightly different map. This is from Department of Ag here in Wisconsin, and what this map shows in green or blue are basically townships or tribal lands where emerald ash borer has been confirmed. Areas that are light yellowish or grayish are spots where we have not yet detected emerald ash borer activity. It could be there perhaps, just hasn't been formally detected yet, but those yellowish areas, EAB is either not present or present at undetectable levels at this point. So what does that mean? Well, roughly half or so, maybe 40–50% of the state has not yet seen emerald ash borer. Said a minute or two ago, numerically speaking, most of our ash trees are in northern Wisconsin, black ash and like swampy areas. So this is something that is really going to be playing out in Wisconsin over the course of the next couple of decades, really in our lifetimes. Now, another map to look a bit closer at Wisconsin, this is a map from the DNR, and this categorizes counties on the basis of how much ash mortality there is. So in general, the darker the color, higher the ash mortality. So if you are in a county that is that dark grayish color in this map on the left, that means of the ash trees in that county, 90+% of those are dead at this point. So makes sense. If you are in southeastern Wisconsin where EAB has been the longest, you've got a lot of dead ash trees, and most of the ash trees are dead at this point. Same kind of thing along the Mississippi River near Vernon and Crawford counties. Counties that are in red, we've got between 50–90% mortality. So Madison, Dane County, Sauk County, and so on. There's a bunch of counties that fit into that category. So lots of dead ash trees. There's still some out there that maybe have not been impacted yet or are just starting to decline. Counties that are orange, we've maybe got 50% decline of ash trees. And then counties that are yellow or kind of that light beige color, we don't have a whole lot of ash mortality at this point. So again, the northern parts of Wisconsin really have not faced the brunt of this insect yet. So this is going to be an evolving situation. So that's the lay of the land, so to speak, for EAB in Wisconsin. Now, what are the impacts of emerald ash borer? Turns out EAB can do a lot of different things out there, both in the realm of human kind of social context, but also ecologically. So let's start with some of the economic costs, though. First of all, if you've got a tree that died from EAB, you've got the cost of removing that. That could be as a homeowner, you have to pay a company to come take down your tree. That could be on a municipal scale. As an urban forester, you've got to juggle your budget, and all of a sudden, you've got all these ash trees that are dead and dying. That can take a lot of money and resources to be able to get those down while it's still relatively safe to do so. So there's a lot of costs associated with tree removal. Looking at the bigger picture, ash wood materials have been valued for certain uses, and so there's some loss of timber revenue potentially from this. There were also costs due to regulatory and monitoring efforts at kind of a government scale. So quarantines and surveys for EAB and things like that. There was a lot of money that went into that for a long time. These days in the eastern US, a lot of those quarantines have gone away because EAB has spread so much and efforts have shifted more towards things like biocontrol. There's also costs of insecticide applications. And if you are going to be treating an ash tree for EAB, this is not a one and done treatment. This is a treadmill that you're getting on, and you're going to have to keep doing these treatments on a regular basis to maintain the health of those trees. So that's going to be an ongoing cost, and those costs are going to creep up every year or two that you have to do a treatment. So there's costs there. That could be both the homeowner level, but also municipality level. If you're a city that is treating ash trees to maintain their health, there's costs there as well. There are ecological costs. We've got other insects and animals that rely on ash trees for food or habitat. If those trees are being killed off, those animals can be negatively impacted, of course. We can have changes in forest composition. Some parts, like those swampy areas in northern Wisconsin, that might be 80–90% black ash. If all those ash trees are killed, what is that going to mean for the forest composition? Is another tree going to be able to fill in the gap? Or is it going to switch to more shrubs like dogwood or something like that? And then what is that going to mean for the water table up there? If the swamp land is no longer having these trees sucking up moisture, is the water table going to go up? So there's a lot of kind of unanswered questions at this point. We can have localized extinction of ash trees. We just showed on a map, southeastern Wisconsin, almost 100% of ash trees are dead or dying at this point. Decreased biodiversity because of this in the long run. There's also some social and cultural impacts. So if you have lots of ash trees in public places, like a golf course, that's what we see in this top left picture. That was a golf course in Ohio. Ash trees dead. And so if you have a golf course or a city or municipal park with a lot of large mature ash trees and you lose those, that could really change the feel of things. Also think of it, in some places after the elm trees were removed from Dutch elm, cities planted a lot of ash trees. I know here in Madison, we have some streets like this where there's what we call a green tunnel effect. You've got these big mature ash trees, the canopies actually arch over and meet above the street. And it's beautiful to drive through when the leaves are out because of that green tunnel effect. But if you go from that and those trees are all cut down, that drastically impacts the appearance of that neighborhood. It could have impacts on property value and things like that too. We know there's other benefits of trees like the shade and energy savings from cooling homes and things like that. There's been impacts on things like baseball, of all things, believe it or not, because historically baseball bats were made out of ash wood. It was very strong and sturdy if it was processed properly. Ash wood was also very regularly used for tool handles because of its strength. And all of a sudden, Louisville Slugger and other companies are having to look for other types of wood to be able to still make the same materials they've always made. Ashes such as black ash have been culturally significant for Native Americans, like the Ojibwa in northern Wisconsin have long used black ash for various purposes, such as basket weaving and things like that. So this is having cultural impacts there. And then also one other thing I want to mention is there are hazards associated with dead ash trees. Some of our trees can die. You can have an oak or an elm that dies and they can stand in the woods for decades. Ash trees, once they die, they're probably going to be on the ground within about 5 years, one way or another. That's whether you cut them down or they fall down on their own accord or in a storm. Turns out ash trees dry out and get brittle very, very quickly, and they become hazardous to the point that arborists have been injured or even killed in some cases dealing with these, because you can cut one down or one of them falls unpredictably, it hits the ground, it almost shatters, and shards of branches can go flying. So it can be a very dangerous situation. So in terms of removal, it's often much preferred to take down trees while they're still alive for ash trees, or just after they're dead. If you've got a tree that's been standing dead for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, arborists might say, I don't feel comfortable working on that, or your costs may go up because of some equipment and approaches that they have to use. So keep that in mind. There can be costs, lots of different costs associated with emerald ash borer. Let's very briefly talk about identifying ash trees. So we have about 4 native ash species here in Wisconsin: green and white, black and blue. These are all members of the genus Fraxinus. The commonest ones overall that I see, especially in urban areas, would be green and white ash. If you see those in a neighborhood, a street tree, a park, it's almost certainly those. I've seen a little bit of black ash, certain cultivars sometimes planted as street trees, but green and ash are commonest overall. In native areas, green ash can be very common along rivers and kind of wet areas like that. Northern Wisconsin, black ash can be very common in swampy wetland areas. Blue ash is technically native to little parts of southeastern Wisconsin. In all my years looking at thousands of ash trees, I've maybe seen a handful of blue ash out there. So they're really not common, probably not something you would bump into unless you went looking for them. Now, I do want to point out, knowing the exact ash species isn't super critical because EAB can technically attack all 4 types of ash trees. So for the purposes of this talk, I just want you to be able to identify an ash tree. We're not going to split hairs and worry about identifying the different species of ash trees. One other quick note, there's something called a mountain ash, belongs to the genus Sorbus. That's not a true ash. Mountain ash make these clusters of orangish, very vibrant berries at certain times of the year. That's not a true ash tree. EAB doesn't attack it. We don't have to worry about that. We're worried about true ashes, so green, white, black, and blue in this case. So how do you identify an ash tree? Well, the first thing I look at, you can do this during the winter months or during the summer months, the branching pattern, the pattern that the twigs and branches split off from the main trunk or from smaller branches or twigs. Turns out ash trees have an opposite branching pattern. Most of our common trees, like oaks and elms, have an alternate pattern. So an opposite pattern means in that upper left-hand photo, we see the main twig coming out like this, and then the 2 smaller twigs or branches come off across directly opposite one another. With alternate branching, one may come out here, and then the other one is going to come out slightly offset at a different position. So that's alternate, but opposite, they come out right across from each other. So when you see opposite branching, two things come to mind for common trees. That's ashes or maples. And most folks are going to recognize maples right away. One that might trip you up a little bit would be box elders, which are technically a type of maple, but sometimes those can be mixed up for ash trees. So opposite branching, ash trees have compound leaves. So your typical maple leaf kind of looks like the palm of your hand. It's one unit and the leaf, and then it branches out or kind of spreads out from there. With compound leaves, you got the central stalk, and then little leaflets come out from that. With ash trees, it's typically 5 or 7, sometimes as many as 9 or potentially 11 leaflets, but a lot of cases it's probably about 7. The bark of ash trees, if you're very familiar with it, that can be useful. You get these deep ridges, kind of elongated diamond shapes. But I will say, don't look just at the bark. That can mix you up with some other things. I have had cases where folks are looking at the bark, and especially for like black walnuts and similar trees, it can sometimes be similar to ash, but you look at the branching pattern and it's very different, for example. And then the seeds or samaras. We're all familiar with the kind of whirligig leaves, or I'm sorry, seeds on maples. Those are kind of bilobe. They come off and they spin around. These seeds or samaras on ash trees are more like an elongated teardrop. They're individual things. And so when the seed detaches, it can still flutter through the air, but it's not a bilobe structure like on maple leaves. So those are the main features to look for to help you identify ash trees. Switching gears to emerald ash borer biology, let's take a look at what the insects actually look like. This is an adult emerald ash borer. The photo on the left, we see the back or dorsal side. That surface of the body is relatively flat. You can see how they get their name of emerald ash borer because they're this really actually a pretty metallic green color. It's a pretty insect. What it does to trees is not pretty though. The underside of the body is curved or rounded, and it often has a coppery appearance, especially on the abdomen. So we see that in the kind of center photo. Then you can see it as well on the bottom right-hand photo. These insects as adults are roughly 1/2 inch long, and they're about 1/8 of an inch wide. And in the genus Agrilus here in Wisconsin, we've got about 50 species, and EAB tends to be bigger than most of our native species. So the size can be useful to actually tell apart EAB. Like if you had a similar looking or a species or color variation, you have to look at some other features under the microscope. But if you see something like this and there's an ash tree nearby, it's almost certainly it's going to be emerald ash borer. And just for side reference, there is an adult emerald ash borer on a penny. So again, about 1/2 inch long, give or take a little bit. When the adults are out, they are feeding, they are nibbling on leaves a little bit, but they cause a trivial amount of damage. I do want to point out, I mentioned earlier, some close lookalikes that are native. On the left, we've got bronze birch borer, goes after stressed birch trees. Two-line chestnut borer goes after stressed oak trees. So again, these look similar. They're very closely related, but they're native, and they don't go after healthy trees. They go after the ones that are stressed and compromised. Let's look at the damaging life stage. These are the larvae, so they're kind of worm-like. They can get up to 1 inch long, but when they just hatch out of an egg, they're going to be really pretty small in size and hard to really locate or identify, but they get up to about 1 inch long or just over that. In terms of their color, they are pale, again, kind of worm-like, so pale or cream colored. They do have a darkened head capsule. We can see that in the upper right-hand corner, that right-hand photo, some dark materials. Those are some of the mouth parts, for example, but a lot of their head is actually retracted down into kind of their neck region, the thorax. So we don't see some of those structures particularly well. You can really make out the abdominal segmentation though, and especially towards the tip of the body, some of those segments have a distinctive bell-shaped kind of flare to them. So that's helpful. And then at the very end of the abdomen, there's these two kind of pincher-like structures. Those are called urogompi. They can't pinch with those. They can't sting or anything like that. Urogompi are commonly used to identify larval beetles. It's just a common feature. And for this type of insect, it can be very useful to confirm the identity of this specimen. Now, I mentioned that the larvae, that's the damaging life stage that we care about. So they are feeding underneath the bark. They are feeding on the vascular tissues that's basically girdling the tree from the inside over the span of about 2 to 3 years. If you have really high EAB populations, if it's a new infestation, this is a drawn out process that probably takes about 5 years or so. And again, as they damage those tissues, water and nutrients can't flow underneath the bark. So that really causes problems in the long run. And it's really the cumulative damage that all adds up to tree decline. Because this causes damage very slowly, again, that initial detection is hard to really pick out. You might just notice a little bit of thinning canopy in the upper parts of the tree, but there can be a lot of other causes for that as well, like drought and adverse weather conditions can cause some thinning canopy as well. But by the time you really look at your ash tree and you say, that canopy is pretty thin, it's probably been there for a couple years and has been working its way progressively down the trunk. That complicates management and treatment, because once that canopy dies back too much, treatments are not going to be effective. So treatments are better as a preventative, or when a tree is just been infested. The tree's been infested for a couple of years, those treatments are generally going to work very, very poorly, if at all. Let's look at the life cycle of this insect. Let's start at the 3 o'clock position, because that's basically where we are right now. So emerald ash borer will overwinter as pretty mature larvae. They've been in that stage for really many months at that point, but they'll go through the winter as larvae. They will pupate in the spring, and the pupal stage is relatively short, so they're transforming from the larva to the adult stage at that point in their lives. And then in late spring into early summer, the adults pop out. So for us in Wisconsin, that's generally going to be maybe around Memorial Day onward. So the month of June is a big month for the adults being out and about. As we get into July, they're really starting to taper off. When the adults are out, I said they really don't cause much damage. They nibble a bit on leaves. They lay eggs after mating. Those eggs are on the bark of ash trees. They eventually hatch. The larvae tunnels through the bark, and then it's going to be there feeding on the vascular tissues. Now, some other really important aspects of the biology of these insects. So they are gregarious and they love sunny spots. That's why they start infesting trees in the upper canopy. They work their way down as the sunlight can penetrate. It also means that if you have, say, a forested area, it's usually not the trees in the middle of the woods that are attacked first. It's things on the edge where you get more sun. In more urban settings, trees that are growing out in the open in parks or in yards, for example, can often be attacked first. So they really like those sunny trees. They do work their way down the canopy. I mentioned this before. The adults are decent flyers. If you put them in a wind tunnel and force them to fly, they can go quite a ways. Otherwise, for the most part, they stay relatively close to home. It's humans moving them around. And again, they will attack both healthy and stressed trees, and they'll attack trees of all sizes. Although if you have a really young ash tree, they don't attack those quite yet. It's a little too small in diameter. Once the trees get big enough, they'll be attacked because they're susceptible at that point. Now let's talk about the signs and symptoms of EAB. So we'll talk about these individually, but we've got 3 symptoms. These are things that are suspicious. They certainly can indicate emerald ash borer, but these symptoms can occur for other purposes or from other causes. So just seeing the symptoms doesn't mean it's EAB, but it can be a major red flag. And if you're seeing these on an ash tree in the state, there's a good chance it could be emerald ash borer, but it's not guaranteed. Then we've got some really definitive signs. These are pieces of evidence you look at, and that definitively indicates emerald ash borer. So these are the larval tunnels, exit holes, and finding the larvae for adults, of course. So let's look at these symptoms. Woodpecker activity. That basically means woodpeckers have found some sort of insect beneath the bark. There are native insects that attack ash trees. Could they be going after those? That's possible. But again, if you've got EAB in your area and you see trees that look like this, most likely going to be emerald ash borer. And with EAB, as they work their way down the canopy, the woodpeckers start going after larvae on the main trunk. And that trunk of the tree can almost have a manila folder color and appearance. When you see trees that look like that, they've probably been infested for multiple years, and it's really too far gone to treat at that point. Epicormic shoots or suckering, this is where you get sprouts coming out at, say, the base of the trunk. This can occur for a number of reasons: soil compaction, storm damage, and things like that. To a certain extent, it's almost like the tree is gasping for breath, and it's trying to do some more photosynthesis, get more energy for the tree. It's trying to survive. So this, again, isn't specific to EAB, but if you have an ash tree infested with EAB, this easily can happen as well. So that's another symptom that we can bump into. I will say, though, you can have ash trees die from EAB where you never see that the basal sprouting or epicormic shoots. And then canopy thinning. And again, canopy thinning simply means the tree is dying or something bad is going on. That could be other insects, could be disease like cankers, could be physical damage. Maybe if you've taken the weed whacker or a lawnmower and you keep bumping into the tree and damaging the bark, that can cause thinning over time. But if you have an ash tree with emerald ash borer, give it time. The canopy will thin as that tree is dying out. And again, this is going to be a progressive thinning over the course of typically multiple years with emerald ash borer. So that's another symptom. You'll see it with EAB, but other things can cause canopy thinning too. Then on to these more definitive signs. So these would really point to emerald ash borer being the cause for it. Larval tunnels, which we call galleries technically, and bark splitting. So as those larvae are feeding beneath the bark, they meander back and forth in kind of this S shape or serpentine pattern. So you get these S-shaped meandering tunnels. That's what we see in the photo on the left. If you have lots of larvae though, like the photo on the right shows an individual meandering gallery. The one on the left though shows a whole bunch of galleries that can overlap. And so you kind of lose the distinctive S shape because there's just so many galleries from dozens or hundreds of larvae in a relatively small area. So the photo on the left, that would be a tree. We've got tunneling on the main trunk. So that's a very, very advanced infestation. It's probably been present for many years at that point. One other thing, and this can be more common on some of the higher branches, maybe branches that are 2, 3, 4 inches in diameter, you get some EAB tunneling in there. The tree tries to wall it off, almost form this callus-like tissue that can cause the bark to split open. And so you could look up, see splitting in branches. You might be able to see the meandering tunnels in there. That would be another pretty definitive sign that you've got emerald ash borer. The exit holes of EAB are distinctly D-shaped because their backside, their dorsal side is flat. The underside, their belly, if you will, that's rounded. So the photo on the left shows a D-shaped exit hole, and those are 1/8 of an inch wide. That's very distinctive for emerald ash borer and other members of that genus Agrylus. We've got some other insects native associated with ashes. The holes are going to be different sizes or different shapes. So banded ash clearwing, this top center photo, those are round 1/4 inch holes. Red-headed ash borer, those are oval holes about 1/4 inch wide. Eastern ash bark beetle, these are teeny tiny holes, like 1/16 of an inch. Looks like someone peppered the tree with a bird shot from a shotgun or something like that. Just these little individual BB holes, typically many clustered together in a small area. That's a different insect, but the D-shaped exit holes, 1/8 inch in width, that's a sign of emerald ash borer. And then if you peel bark, you find larvae, or you happen to spot some adults, those are additional definitive signs that EAB is present. So that's what you should be looking for if you've got ash trees in your area. Now let's switch gears and talk about management of EAB. There's a lot of different approaches. Some of these I'm just going to talk about briefly, like quarantines and restricting movements. Because EAB is so well established here, we're really not dealing with quarantines anymore for this insect. For example, here in Wisconsin, because it's pretty widespread. One of the key aspects of quarantines was to help limit the spread of EAB to new areas. So that has kind of disappeared. We still have some restrictions in movement. For example, if you have camped at a state park or seen signs, the DNR has rules. You have to obtain your firewood, for example, from within a certain distance. So often outside state parks, you'll see folks selling firewood nearby. But if you wanted to bring it from your own house, from your own yard, there's rules against that. Removal and replacement of trees. We'll talk about that briefly. Host plant resistance, we'll talk about that briefly. Spend a lot of time talking about insecticide treatments and a little bit on biocontrol. So removal and replacement. I mentioned this earlier, there's costs associated with this. This can really impact the overall look and feel of a neighborhood. If you go from that top center photo to the bottom center photo, night and day difference in terms of what that street is going to look like. It's probably going to affect cooling and energy costs and stuff like that too. But imagine if you had that green tunnel effect from mature trees. That really changes the look and feel of a neighborhood. There's also costs associated with removal. So if you are a city forester, you've got to balance. Do I spend a whole bunch of money cutting down all the trees? Do I treat all the trees? Do I treat some? Do I maybe cut down the ones that are under power lines and not doing so well anyways and pick and choose? And so there are some useful utilities available out there. Dr. Cliff Sadoff, for example, at Purdue, he has developed the EAB cost calculator to help municipal foresters make some of these informed decisions. And then I also want to mention there are costs of doing nothing. And I mentioned this earlier, but ash trees can become very, very hazardous if you just let them stand, because within about 5 years, they lose moisture very quickly. They get to be brittle and they can be dangerous if you leave them up. So keep in mind, if you have a tree in your yard and you say, I'm just going to let it do its thing, be a habitat for owls or squirrels or whatnot, once it dies within probably 5 years, it's going to come down. And if that hits your car, your house, neighbor stuff, that's going to be a big, insurance headache to deal with. Also, if these trees are out in natural areas, pay attention when you are hiking, when you are camping. Don't set that tent up when there's a bunch of dead, dying ash trees around you. If you are a hunter and you're going to put up a tree stand, be aware of that, because these trees can break relatively easily compared to other trees. I do want to mention there is a Wisconsin DNR publication, FR 766, that discusses this particular topic. I worked a couple years ago with some colleagues at the DNR to help create this document. Just discusses some of these hazards associated with dead, dying ash trees. So just be aware of that. It's better to take down trees when they're in decent health still, or if they have just died. If you put it off and put it off and put it off, it can get dangerous and more expensive to do that. Post-plant resistance. So the idea behind this is, can we find or breed some sort of tolerant or resistant ash? In the long run, possibly, but this is not any sort of immediate solution. There's a little bit of a glimmer of hope, though. There are surveys for what we call lingering ash. This is where scientists go to an area where EAB is just like kind of nuked everything, taken out all the ash trees, and folks look for survivors, which we call lingering ash. There's been efforts here in Wisconsin. There's been efforts in Michigan, and I've seen some research published out of Michigan where scientists had gone into these areas and they found some ash trees that not only survived, but showed evidence of being attacked and being able to recover from that. So that's some good news. Still, looking at the bigger picture, we're going to lose 90, 95, 99% of all our ash trees. 50, 100, 200 years from now, could there be a program to kind of reintroduce resistant ash into the natural ecosystem? That's possible, but this is kind of a long-term effort and game plan. Otherwise, mostly what we're dealing with is removing trees. We're dealing a lot with insecticide treatments. There are two main categories of treatments. There are products for arborists and tree care professionals. They've got a bunch of options. I'll talk you through these. They've got a bunch of techniques and equipment that they can use, but sometimes this requires specialized training. And some of these treatments can be expensive. You pull up a price for some of these products, and it can be $400 or $500 just to get a jug of the chemical itself. Then if you needed the injection equipment, that could be another $500 or $1,000. So these aren't things that homeowners are going to be doing themselves. There are some homeowner products. These are basically imidacloprid soil drenches. Sometimes there's a second ingredient to that. There's also acephate, but that one has a lot of caveats attached to it. These can often be purchased at hardware stores or garden centers, sometimes online for some of them. And I want to say there's just a lot of misconceptions about chemical treatments. Are all ash trees doomed? No. Can we save and protect them? We can if we do the treatments properly. Those trees are in good health to begin with. If you've got a tree where it's already lost 60% of its canopy, it's just too late for that tree. The treatments aren't going to be effective for that case. Are the insecticide treatments cost effective? Depends on the situation and scenario, or that sometimes folks think there's only one effective treatment. There's a number of effective treatments, but you have to understand some of the caveats associated with them. So let's look at the treatments for arborists or tree care professionals. Up at the top of the list, we've got emamectin benzoate. That's the actual chemical name. This is a trunk injected product. There's imidacloprid, which homeowners can also get, but the arborists have different products and they can legally apply it at a higher rate, which is important for larger trees. We know once ash trees increase in diameter to a certain size, about 15 inches or so, you need a higher dosage to get full protection of the tree. Arborists can do that with their products. Homeowners cannot legally do that with the homeowner products. Imidacloprid can also be applied as a soil injection or a trunk injection in some cases. Dinoteffuran, this is a very water-soluble product. It can be applied as a soil drench, usually not though. It's more commonly applied as a basal bark spray. So they actually mix it up in a pump sprayer. They will spray it onto the lower portion of the trunk. It wicks through the trunk and then moves upwards into the tree. There's azadirachtin, which is technically an organic product delivered by trunk injection. And then I want to mention there are pyrethroid bark sprays, but these do not get through the bark. So in theory, you could spray these on the trunk of the tree, but you're probably going to get a cloud of insecticide and drift. And the idea is kill the small larvae before they can tunnel in. But in general, folks tend not to do these sorts of treatments. They're tending to do probably these top D treatments. And especially for arborists, often that top one, emamectin benzoate trunk injections, is a very common approach. I do have an extension fact sheet on this topic on our EAB site. We'll share some links with you in just a little bit. So to show you what these look like, there's soil drenches. You measure the diameter of the tree. That dictates your dosage. You pull back the mulch. You pour it around the base of the tree. You let it soak in. You replace the mulch. So very non-invasive. There's soil injections where you use what looks like a giant syringe. You push down into the ground. Basal bark sprays for dinotephoran. You can see the guy is just spraying about the lower 5 or so feet of that trunk, and it's going to absorb through the bark and then move upwards into the canopy. Then there are these trunk injections, and this requires actually drilling or poking holes through the bark. So that does have some trade-offs. You're causing a little bit of wounding. Is there a possibility for a disease pathogen to get in? Slight possibility. Often with these treatments, you drill a hole, immediately push in a plastic plug, and then you insert the insecticide through that. But there's a couple of different vendors out there with different styles of equipment. But these trunk injections, they actually drill or make a hole in the trunk through the bark and inject the chemicals right into those vascular tissues. So you don't have to wait for uptake from the roots. There are homeowner options that I mentioned. This is imidacloprid. Sometimes, like the stuff you can find at Menards and other hardware stores, it'll have a second ingredient, clothianidin, which is very closely related. Those are both neonicotinoids. These are generally applied as a soil drench, which I showed you already. You mix it in a bucket, you pour it around the base of the tree. There's a lot of root mass there. It gets absorbed up. But you can only legally apply at a rate, and it's going to be lower than the arborist rate. So for large trees, homeowners really can't fully protect those trees with this route. There's also acephate trunk implants, where again, you have to drill into the tree. You have to pound in these plugs. They're about 1.25 inches long, tap them in with a hammer. But if you have a tree that's just over 1 foot in diameter, let's say 13 inches in diameter, you've got to drill a total of 10 holes around that tree. And you'd have to do this every year. So that's a lot of drilling into that tree again and again and again. Now, if trees are healthy, they can basically heal over those drilling sites. It might take a year or 2 years, but with these trunk implants, that can be a lot of drilling for a homeowner. With the professional treatments, it's usually not every 4 inches. It's going to be spaced out greater than that. Nonetheless, we do have an extension fact sheet on the homeowner options as well. Now, in terms of timing for these treatments to work properly, timing is important. EAB adults pop out for Madison area, usually around Memorial Day and especially the month of June. That's about 450 to 500 growing degree days. If you're familiar with growing degree days, great. That can be a little bit more accurate than just temperature or calendar dates. This is also, if you use phenological indicators, about the time of black locust in bloom. We need to do this ahead of time so systemic products can move upwards. So soil treatments like imidacloprid, we have to be doing this in either April for larger trees, bigger than about 8 inches diameter. If you've got a small tree that's, say, 7 inches diameter, you could do that in early May as an example. The bark sprays, dinotephoran, because those move more quickly, you could do it a little bit later, maybe more of early May. That can be about 2 to 3 weeks after when you do the soil drenches. And then the trunk injections like emamectin benzoate, you would ideally do in spring after the canopy is leafed out. But the emamectin treatments are really fairly forgiving. And there are municipalities that are doing those treatments throughout the entire growing season because they've got so many ash trees that they're treating. And that product seems to last for a long time. So there have been good results with treatments at other times of the year for emamectin trunk injections. Now, a couple final thoughts on insecticide treatments. I really want to emphasize that these treatments are not one and done. This is a temporary protection of individual trees. So you are going to have to continue on an annual basis for most treatments, or for those chunk injections about every other year or every third year, be treating those trees indefinitely for the lifespan of those trees. There's a lot of unknowns. Eventually, we might get to a point where we can cut back on treatments, but we still don't know that yet. So think of it as you're going to have to keep treating these trees with these insecticides to maintain the health of those trees indefinitely. So those costs will add up over time. Also, these treatments will not eradicate emerald ash borer from area. It's to protect those individual trees. Also, these are not viable for large areas, forested areas, for woodlots. There's the cost of that as one component. There's also very specific restrictions on the annual amount that you can apply per acre per year for imidacloprid and dinotefuran. And this is something that I've even seen arborists sometimes not be aware of. And you do the math and you might be able to legally treat, say, 3-4 trees in a yard. But if you've got 10 ash trees, you might not be able to legally treat all those. So that's an important consideration too. Also, we know that the soil drench treatments that homeowners can use, once the trees get big enough to a certain size, the canopy increases exponentially. And so you need a higher dosage to fully protect those trees. And homeowners can't legally do that with their products. The arborists can with their imidacloprid products, or they could use trunk injections of emamectin benzoate. And also I want to mention there's a really good multi-state guide. I'll refer to this in another slide here as I wrap up. If you want to know all the ins and outs of EAB treatments, that document on the right-hand portion of the slide is a great resource. One other fact sheet I want to mention just very briefly, you might be wondering, should I even treat my ash trees? I've got a fact sheet that discusses that. Things you got to look at: what's the health of the tree? What's the location? Is it under a power line? Maybe it makes more sense to take that one out. Does it have a structural defect? Maybe it's got some storm damage or a crack, and it makes more sense to take those down and plant something of higher value. You got to look at cost of treatment and so on. So I've got guidance for this on our UW Emerald Ash Borer website. Very briefly, biocontrol. The USDA, our government, has imported some natural enemies, some parasitic wasps from the native range of emerald ash borer, brought them over here, screened them to make sure they're not going to hurt other things, and they've been doing some releases. Now, we're still relatively early in the ball game. These releases have been going on for not even 15 years, and I will say it's really time and labor intensive to raise these beneficial insects, because you need live emerald ash borer to do that. And so that's a big headache. They've gotten better and more efficient over time, but it's not an easy thing to do. Just to show you where there's been biocontrol releases nationally, we see releases that map on the left. Within Wisconsin, we have had releases going back for over a decade. And there's also been sites where DNR, for example, has recovered these, meaning that they've introduced them. They seem to get a foothold. What will this mean for the long run? We don't fully know, but it's possible that we might hit a critical mass at some point, and these things could turn the tide against emerald ash borer, but we have to stay tuned for that. Otherwise, to wrap up, I will probably end on this slide for questions, but we've got the UW Emerald Ash Borer website. That's where you can locate our treatment and Is My Tree Worth Treating for EAB fact sheets. There's the Emerald Ash Borer Info Network. And then there's also my website for the UW Insect Diagnostic Lab. And with that, Peggy and Ann, I will hand it over to you for questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, PJ, for that in-depth coverage. You've answered a lot of the questions that have been in the chat or in the Q&A box. So I want to thank you so much for joining us today, PJ. And again, remind all of our attendees, those resources that you still are seeing on the screen, those are some of the best resources that we have. And then also, we will have a recording of this presentation available, and you can find that recording again at our Horticulture Extension website under the Video Programs Archive. So with that, we will get into some of the questions. We only have time for a couple, so I'm going to wrap a few together. If you could just reiterate the the susceptibility of other trees. You talked right at the beginning about the green, black, white, and blue ash in the Fraxinus genus. Um, are there other trees? And specifically, somebody had put in the Q&A that they have been told by professionals that their birch trees are being attacked by emerald ash borer.
I have not heard of any confirmed reports of birch trees being attacked by emerald ash borer. I did mention that bronze birch borer, which the same genus as EAB, it's native, very similar, almost identical body shape and appearance. The color's a little bit different. That one will go to stressed birch trees, but I have not heard any confirmed reports of emerald ash borer attacking birch trees. One other tree worth mentioning, which in Wisconsin, I don't know if I've ever seen it. There's something called white fringe tree that it has been reported in the literature to be attacked by emerald ash borer. It's from the same tree family, the olive family, as ashes. But again, depending on where you are in the country, if you're in Wisconsin, it's not something that's going to be very common. It's occasionally planted horticulturally, but that's about it.
All right. And we just have a minute left. So again, many of the questions that came in are for folks who are just wrestling with the decision of what to do. I know I have ash trees, and in several of the questions, not seeing damage yet. They're small ash trees, or they have several ash trees. Could you just wrap up one more time by giving that overview of, as a homeowner, a landowner, like, where should I start? How can I figure this out if I should be treating or not?
Yeah, and that's tough. What I would look at, like if I had a yard with, say, some woods behind it that were also mine, you're really not going to be able to treat trees in the woods. I talked about the cost, also limitations on amount of some of the insecticides you can use per year legally, and you might only be able to treat a few trees total per acre. What I would look at, and especially this refers back to that fact sheet, is my ash tree worth treating for emerald ash borer? That's going to discuss a lot of those key points and things you should be thinking about. If you have one or two or three ash trees in your yard that are in a spot that you like, maybe they shade your back deck or patio area, that's great, and they're in good health, those are good candidate trees for treatments. If you have trees that are not in good health because the canopy is already thinning, that's probably not worth it to treat. Once the trees get 30 to 50% or more canopy thinning, the treatments aren't really going to be effective against those. So there's a lot of factors, but you can really only look at probably treating a couple trees in your yard in most cases. In my own yard, personally, I do have a white ash that I have been treating. It is in good health. It shades our backyard. It's our main yard tree. So until I can get some more trees planted to get some shade, I'm going to be continuing to treat that tree, and I'll make a decision down the road. It's a tree that my son's swing is in. So it's got family value for us. It provides shade that's going to help with energy bills in terms of cooling the house a little bit. So there's a lot of factors you got to look at, in that fact sheet I mentioned will help walk you through some of those.
All right. Again, we thank all of you, over 200 attendees today on our webinar. So we thank you all for joining. We have the great resources that we've been sharing. We will have the recording that can be shared. PJ has made his slide presentation available, and we've had the link to that in the chat as well. So thank you all for attending, and a huge, huge thank you to our extension entomologist, PJ Liesch, for joining us today for this emerald ash borer identification and actions webinar. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye. Have a great day.